Okay, seniors, welcome to the first of the 2-week 31 lectures. This one's on business cycles, followed by its larger cousin, economic indicators. Now, these are topics that are really good right now for two reasons. Number one is that they're going to kind of tie up everything we've been talking about so far before we move into a little bit more minutia and then finally the personal finance units after spring break. But number two, the following of business cycles and the following of various economic indicators are going to be a major focus for economists going forward in the United States and really the rest of the world right now, including myself. I will be very closely following this information, and when we come back from spring break, I will be finding some form or other through which we can have conversations, or at the very least, I can point you guys in the direction so that you can do your own self-studies about how the ongoing pandemic is affecting the business cycles and, of course, the health of the economies. So first, looking at business cycle, it's a simple question. When you're looking at a business cycle in a specific country, you are looking at whether or not the economy is getting better or worse. And you will notice this question is a movement question. It's not considering that the economy stays the same, because economies never stay the same. That is kind of a false belief in some people that the economy is doing great because nothing's changing. That's not how it works. Economies are always moving in one direction or other. The movements just might be so small that most people don't notice them. Now, speaking of small, excuse me, micro versus macro. So, we've already been covering things in both of these topics as we'd been going on through the class so far, but we hadn't really labeled them. So at this point, guys, anything we've talked about that had to do with personal or small finances, meaning those solo businesses or the partnership businesses or the individual worker or the family filing tax returns, all of that is what we call microeconomics. By contrast, macroeconomics, which we've only looked at a little bit and discussed a little bit, is the large scale. That's when you're looking at the entire country or when you're looking at the globe. That's going to be something that, again, Mr. Barber and other economists are going to be very closely paying attention to as we go forward. Now, moving into the meat of the information. As always, guys, you can pause to write down your notes, or you can simply do the written version first without the video commentary and just come back and listen for additional information. Please also try to remember, guys, I'm compressing a 40-minute lecture into about 10 to 12 minutes. So, here we go. Okay, so gross domestic product. Very basic concept, one of the core ideas for macroeconomics. It is the total value measured in dollars, or of course whatever your currency is in different nations, of the final goods and service produced within the nation each year. So GDP is a number that is calculated every single year, and it's measured year to year, and it's one of the major economic indicators. So what it tells us is whether the economy got bigger, meaning expanded, or it shrunk and got smaller over year to year. Now, what the business cycle is it's the halfway point between micro and macro that lets economists and business leaders understand the relationship of the economy. They look at the GDP, determine whether it's growing or shrinking, and they then plan accordingly. And the details of what those plans are to follow. Now, the business cycle, guys, has phases. It expands, grows, it peaks, meaning it will eventually hit a maximum area, and then after that it begins contraction or shrinking, and it will eventually bottom out into what's called the trough. Now, this is the most important graphic of this entire lecture. You will note it is always moving, it's always going up and always going down. Economies do not go in permanent one direction or other. Okay, if they do, it's only going to be down, and that's only shortly before an entire country collapses into civil war or some other kind of massive disaster and the new one takes over. Other than that, economies never sit still. They are always in constant flux. For those of you guys who have been to the beach, think of it like the waves in the ocean. They're always coming and going, surging and retreating, and it's this constant movement. Sometimes it's high tide and the water is further up the beach, it's closer. Sometimes it's low tide and it's overall retreated, but it's still always in motion, expanding, peaking, contracting, troughing, expanding, peaking, contracting, and so on. Now, expansion, what we call a bull market, because everybody loves steak, is the good time. Wages go up. Unemployment tends to be low. And this is what you guys have been experiencing the last several years. Basically, since about 2014, 2015, the U.S. has been enjoying a period of expansion. In fact, a slightly longer than average one, which we'll get to momentarily. Now, here's what this means to the individual. People tend to be optimistic. Okay, we're simple creatures and we are not rational. So when we see the economy's doing well, we tend to be overly optimistic and we spend our money. Goods, especially luxury goods, go into higher demand. Businesses are more likely to be started. It's easier to get loans because there's more money floating around. Businesses make profit, stock prices increase, and the richer get richer. Then you hit the peak. When you hit the peak, you hit a period during which the economy has stopped growing. Think of it like that moment on the roller coaster. It's very brief, where you've hit the very top and you know you're about to go down the hill. The GDP maxes out. Businesses are struggling to produce more goods due to demand not increasing. They don't hire more people because they don't need the additional labor. And the cycle begins to contract. You get this momentary blip, and we enter contraction. During contraction, businesses lay off people, unemployment increases, and jobs decline. And remember, this is a normal thing. However, what we become concerned with in terms of the recessions or depressions is when contraction goes beyond a normal cyclical period. People become pessimistic, they stop spending money, they become more likely to save their money, and banks stop lending money. They start hoarding it for their CEOs and for their rainy day funds. And then you enter the bleak period, the trough. So, the economy does what's called bottoming out. It reaches its lowest point. Now, the good thing is, generally speaking, troughs are like peaks. They are relatively brief periods of time, rarely lasting more than a handful of months or a year or so before the economy starts to increase again. And remember, they are normal up until this point. Stock prices are down, high unemployment, low spending, and generally speaking, they tend to go up with two exceptions. The first is the recession. A recession is a long period of contraction. You'll note there, lasting over 6 months. Now again, recessions are normal. They happen all the time. That being said, you can have severe recessions or you can have a full-on depression. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of details about them, but essentially, guys, the big difference is that a recession is a long period of mild to moderate negativity in the economy, whereas a depression is a burst of severe negative growth and negative business in the economy. Now, 4 things, generally speaking, guys, keep the business cycle going. The first is investment. The simple fact of money, right? Money moves. We've talked about this before, about how money doesn't like to stand still. It likes to make more of itself. So money tends to move around. Companies invest it, they create jobs, people spend money on things, and all that. Then we move on to interest rates and credits, right? We talked about credit 2 weeks ago, I believe, 3 weeks ago, where we talked about how the ability to borrow money you don't have on hand allows you to expand your economic options. Low interest rates tend to drive greater loaning and greater credit, and therefore larger investment. Now, this third one is very important because this speaks to once again, the theory of economics assumes rational decisions, but the reality of it is that humans are not rational, and consumer expectations push a massive amount of the business cycle. When people feel good about themselves, they spend money. When they're afraid, they stop spending money, they start hoarding it or saving it. And even when they don't have to, this can cause problems. You guys have literally seen this happen with the hoarding of toilet paper and the shutting down of businesses. Okay, the bottoming out of the Dow Jones during this pandemic. While some of it is a legitimate response to the changing situation, a lot of it is driven purely by irrational fears. For instance, things like the shortage of N95 medical masks, which should not be nearly as bad as it is, but because of irrational behavior, people fearing a recession and a lack of supply, hoarded and bought out hundreds of thousands of units of them when they did not need them and may never need them, therefore causing shortages. And the last one, of course, is the external shock. The external shocks, which, of course, you guys know exactly what that is, natural disasters like a pandemic. So, because you guys were not alive yet, from 92 to 2000 was the longest period of expansion in U.S. history. Basically, starting with the post-Bush 1 years and the early Clinton years, the U.S. had a period of unprecedented growth, during which we actually managed to stay out of any kind of major military conflict. Spending was mostly focused on domestic policies, a little bit of good luck kicked in, and we experienced this great growth. However, from 2000 to 2001, we had peaked and contraction was beginning, though the second Bush administration, this is Bush Jr., denied it. And this also speaks to one of those problems where, burying your head in the sand and hoping it goes away has nothing to do with economic cycles. It's still going to happen. Then, of course, September 11th occurred. The U.S. entered into a new forever war, and the business cycle moved into a much larger contraction, and we started to see more frequent periods of contraction until 2008, when we entered a full-blown recession, the worst one in American history. Now, why should you guys care? Well, you're all going to have a job. If the economy goes into a contraction period, job growth slows or disappears, meaning that if you find yourself in an intolerable job and you just want to quit it, you're less likely to find another job. And of course, this is a ladder scale system where the more skills you have, the easier it is to find one. The less skills you have, the harder it is to find one in a normal circumstance. And in a contraction, or even worse, a recession, or even worse, a depression, that becomes even more difficult. However, if the economy is doing good, if the business cycle is on an expansion, more jobs are available. It's easier for people to move up the ladder, switch careers, or find jobs in the same career but a better company. Big purchases. Okay? During a contraction, you should not be making big purchases like homes and cars, except for one factor. Okay, follow the second bullet. When the economy starts to slow down, interest rates go down. So here's a great example. Mr. Barber was hoping to sell his house this summer. However, because we are entering a period of contraction and quite likely a recession, that's going to be a bit difficult. People aren't going to have the money. On the other hand, if I can sell my house this summer, the interest rates are going to be fantastic, and this will be a great time to buy a house because it's going to be cheap. So, quick review, guys. Okay. In the business cycle, wages go up during expansion. They go down during contraction. So those are key terms to know. Wages are at their highest during a peak. Wages are at their lowest in a trough. I know, the original teacher had fun with the animations. Borrowing decreases during contraction, and it increases during expansion. It's at its lowest during the trough. Unemployment is at its lowest during the peak. Business profits, highest at the peak. And you guys should be looking for jobs during expansions. You should be holding on to your jobs during contractions. So there we go. That is business cycles.